PTSD is the reason why you feel this way, because old trauma can create emotional patterns that become subconscious and they get unregulated. This is Dr. Spencer Coaches. Today I'm going to talk to you about PTSD and its impact upon your current life. Because a lot of people have trauma in their history and it goes unnoticed and untreated. And what happens is it creates these emotional patterns that cause you to behave in a certain way. Behavioral patterns such as getting triggered, getting emotionally upset, and raging out on people, or going through these mood swings, going through depression, crying, sadness, grief, having anxiety, and having this depression, and most of all, this over-the-top anger or rage. And the reason why that happens is because when you have trauma, it creates this pattern in the brain. You see, the brain is hardwired to protect yourself, and you have something called the flight or fight system. There's also two other responses called the freeze and the fawn response. Now, you may be familiar with the flight or fight term. In fact, most people are familiar with the idea that if a tiger's chasing after you, you're either going to run or you're going to stand and fight the tiger. Now, there's also the freeze or fawn. And what happens is when you are faced with a threatening experience, such as being beaten up, such as even a highly stressful situation, such as being belittled all the time, feeling left out, being ignored, being ostracized, that could also trigger the flight, fight, freeze, or fawn response. So it's basically your instinct to survive. It's inherent in all sentient beings. And it's your instinctual brain. And this is what drives us to live and to avoid danger and to avoid discomfort and only gravitate towards things at which we deem safe and comfortable and reliable. And this causes us to have this dual outlook, this dual nature within ourselves, this kind of polarized mind, good or bad, right and wrong. We avoid everything that we deem wrong and gravitate towards that we deem right. We inherently move away towards that we deem unpleasant, and we go towards that which is pleasant. We move away from that which is uncomfortable or creates discomfort and move towards and gravitate towards that which is comfortable. It causes us to behave in this way and taking it to another level of emotional patterns. So what happens when your mind records the bad incident, it's going to play that memory or store that memory, let's say in the RAM memory. Just like a computer, you have your long-term hard drive memory, then your RAM memory, the random access memory. And that is there because the brain wants to look for danger. It wants to protect you. It's looking out for any potential threats. Now, most of the time when you have one incident of trauma, you may just outgrow it. You may forget about it. And it never bothers you again until that one thing, that person who reminds you of who abused you when you're younger, who beat you up, or maybe the tone of voice sounds like the way your father talked to you or the way your mother talked to you, the way they scolded you really, really harshly. Or the most common form of PTSD is sexual abuse. That's usually with women between high school and college years. And then you may look at men, all men, as potentially threatening. Someone may be wearing the same shirt as that guy who, I don't want to trigger at anybody here, but the guy who abused you. And now he's wearing the same shirt or the same cologne. And it smells like that person. For men, maybe you were beaten by your father. Maybe you were beaten up as a kid by your older brother. Or it could even be a car accident. It could be a war incident. it's usually one incidence of trauma. And most of the time, you outgrow it. Your nervous system is innately hardwired to come to a state of homeostasis, if you will. And the brain will actually let it go and release the patterns because it's a matter of emotional cycling. You see, we naturally want to come to a state of completion. The brain will process the emotions. Your consciousness, your mind, your heart will process the emotions and then come to an understanding, if you will, come to a conclusion that not to go down dark alleys, or not to drive recklessly, or not to use your cell phone and text and drive, or, you look for, call it social cues, character flaws in a person. That person is dangerous by the way they conduct themselves, by the way they live, by their value system, by the way they come across. You begin to avoid those threatening circumstances, situations, and people. And it's completely natural. We as human beings, again, we just want to protect ourselves and live a safe, comfortable, sustainable life. I mean, it's only human to want these good things for ourselves. And anything that threatens it, we're going to gravitate away from. So some things, the point of what I'm saying is just because something is uncomfortable or unpleasant doesn't deem it to be a threat. Because somebody reminds you of that person doesn't mean they are that person. So what happens when you get triggered by the smell, by the color shirt, by the tone of voice, by the gender, by the situation, this emotional response happens, and you go into the same response you had that when you got traumatized. It's called a flashback. Vietnam War veterans were known for this, of having flashbacks of the time of war, and they would actually relive that incident out. In fact, I'll share with you a story. A good friend of mine in junior high, I'm going to leave his name out, was to share with me how his father is a Vietnam veteran, and he would go into these flashbacks. If he'd hear thunder when it would rain, or something on TV that he was watching, he would get triggered. And his mind would believe that his son, who was my friend, was Viet Cong. And he would take off his belt and whip him and start punching him for no reason, thinking that he was beating up the Viet Cong. Now, this is common amongst soldiers and veterans. And it actually started in World War II when soldiers came back from France. They had what was called shell shock. And these were extreme cases where they would be in these tremors and in this state of catatonic state of disassociation, where they're stuck in this other world in their mind. It's like their mind is continuously replaying it, and they look at everybody as if they're in the scene, and they're this extreme level of paranoia. I mean, there's varying degrees of getting triggered and having this, what is known as emotional dysregulation. You see, when you get triggered, the emotions start to go haywire. Because underneath these emotions, what it is anger, rage, fear, guilt, and shame. And it's overwhelming for the brain to process all of these emotions. It's overwhelming for your mind to understand why you feel this way and what happened. Why is this happening to me? Why did that man beat me up? Why did that happen to me? Why did this person abuse me? How come the car hit me? There's this sense of questioning because you want resolution. It's only natural to want to know why. Why did this happen? And the brain, your mind, your intellect, your cognition just can't wrap your head around it. Now, going through therapy often helps you understand. And when we come to a sense of cognitive understanding, that helps us have emotional resolution. Because the confusion, the shock and awe of the moment of the bad experience puts you in a state of haywire where you just can't make sense of it. Why is this happening to me? If you never understand why it happened, now a car accident is a little easier to understand, but why a certain person beat you up or abused you? It's like you don't know what went through that person's mind. And then you begin to blame yourself. I put myself there. It was my fault. I shouldn't have. And there's this sense of self-judgment and self-criticism. And that could lead to a state of depression. So you can see there's many factors going on here that creates this sense of hypervigilance, anxiety, depression, raging out, and emotional upset, extreme emotional reaction. And when you compound these experiences, if you have compounded incidents of trauma, it makes it even more complex. In fact, the term is complex post-traumatic stress disorder. It's not a DSM-5 diagnosis, but is well known within the field of mental health that complex post-traumatic stress disorder, meaning multiple incidences of trauma, wreaks even more havoc on the mind, the personality, and one's behavior. Now, many people suffer from either one of these. The complex is more intense. There's more intense emotional dysregulation. There's a permanent sense of emotional dysregulation because of the changes in the brain. Now, complex post-traumatic stress disorder usually starts in childhood where you have multiple incidences of trauma, meaning there was child abuse. Perhaps there was even a greater extreme. I don't want to trigger anybody, but you were sexually abused by an uncle over many years, or parent, or you had an alcoholic father who beat you for many, many years, or you were kidnapped and tied up or put into a cage or a locked room for many, many months, or you had narcissistic parents who were emotionally and verbally and psychologically abusive to you, constantly belittling you, berating you, saying demoralizing statements over and over and over and over for years on end. This can also equate to the same feeling of being beaten up multiple times. Emotional pain, see, the brain just processes it all as pain. Rejection, the brain processes as physical pain. The brain doesn't know the difference between psychological abuse and physical abuse. It's all pain. And the brain, you're wondering, why is this happening to me? When you have complex post-traumatic stress disorder, it makes permanent changes in the brain through MRI studies. There's a great book called The Body Keeps Score. And that basically is case after case after case of MRI studies of people who have trauma and PTSD, where it actually is multiple instances of trauma, so it's complex post-traumatic stress disorder, through the developmental years shows permanent changes in the brain, where the brain is less competent in its inability to regulate emotions. I'll get into, I don't want to overwhelm you with this scientific knowledge, but I think it needs some clarification. So these MRI studies show that the right occipital lobe, which is the visual cortex, is constantly active, meaning that it's replaying the visual memory over and over and over. The left parahippocampus, which is the part of the brain that's responsible for remembering people and events, is also overactive. So the brain is processing this visual memory of the person or the time period of the circumstance of being abused. That in turn initiates a response from the flight, fight, freeze, or fawn, which is the amygdala part of the brain. And the prefrontal cortex, which is behind the forehead, is responsible for executive decision-making, consequential thinking, shrinks. And that's the part of the brain, there's an actual nerve that connects that part of the brain to the amygdala, shrinks. And the amygdala is enlarged. So the emotional reaction is not regulated and it's amplified. And the memory of the bad experience is constantly played over and over again. This is what happens with complex post-traumatic stress disorder. And there's a sense of disassociation where you're not yourself. You're standing outside of yourself, watching your life happen. And it's hard to reason. It's hard to have any degree of competency, any sense of common sense and reading social cues and understanding situations and being able to read social cues appropriately, to respond effectively, to create harmony, to create laughter, to create peace, to create respect and understanding. Life becomes a game of avoiding any kind of discomfort and danger and trying to charm. You become resilient in your ability to survive. And I'm speaking from experience because I've gone through this. I was tortured when I was 4 and 5 years old. And life became a game to me of surviving, of pleasing and surviving. Because I'll get into this. The flight, fight, freeze, or fawn, you have the fight response. And that's when you fight the situation. You fight the person who's attacking you. And whether you win or not is incidental. You fight them. In other words, you stand up for yourself and grab the bull by its horns, and this is how you live life. You're a warrior. And it's actually the healthy response because it is the actual experience of courage. The other side is the flight response. We all know this. We're going to run from danger, which is a fairly accurate assessment of the dangerous situation where we realize I'm not going to win this. Person comes out with a knife and wants my wallet. Well, I'm going to run away. Chances are that person's not going to chase after me. Running from the situation, there's someone who breaks into your home, you run out the back door. There's a flight response. You run from danger. It's a very healthy response. You're not a chicken for running from danger. It's a healthy response. The problem comes when you avoid any challenge in life. Then you become a coward. It's not a healthy way of being. The other side is the fawn response, the people pleaser. And this usually happens when you have parents who are overly demanding and highly critical and demoralizing, or you're kidnapped and held against your will and forced to live with people whom you don't know and they're just asking you to do things. You read the scenario and you realize the more I please them, the more obedient I become, the better I'm going to be treated. This is what I went through. And it's a matter of just pleasing the abuser to avoid punishment, to avoid abuse. And you get really good at reading people, reading social cues, reading emotional reactions, reading responses, facial expressions, body language, to please them. So you avoid them getting upset, yelling at you, criticizing you, and potentially abusing you. And you go through life in this way. The other side is the freeze response, where your higher function actually shuts down. Your ability to decision-making, comprehension, understanding things well, shuts down. And even your autonomic nervous system, your breath, your heart rate, your digestion shuts down. And you go into this kind of a chameleon response, where chameleons change color in order to blend in with their environment so they don't get eaten by the predator. The same thing happens in the human behavior, where you literally shut your emotions down and go into the analysis paralysis. Only you're not really reading the situations right. This analyzing, this overanalyzing, and never emoting is the right word. Your facial expressions become dull. You have this poker face all the time. The resting bee face, if you know what I mean. And there's no real ability to relate to people because you can't comprehend social cues. You can't read social cues. And there's just a resignation into this frozen state. And you walk around in life analyzing everything. You can even see the body posture, never really relating to anybody because you have to work, you have to live life, you got to go to school, whatever the situation is you're in. You still have to deal with circumstances. And you live life in this analysis paralysis, very cold and not really calculated. We're not talking about a sigma male here. We're talking about the freeze response. There's no emotional well-being in the person. They're just kind of numb to the world. They don't feel anything at all because they're trying to protect them. So you're trying to protect yourself. This is what happens in the freeze response. Because the last thing you want to do when you're getting threatened by, a tiger's chasing after you is digest food, relate to people, or experience any kind of pleasure or joy. You just want to protect yourself. So your digestive system shuts down, blood flow goes away from your internal organs out to your skeletal muscles, so you have energy to run or fight. And you kind of, you feel the adrenaline response. You get charged up. And then you get tunnel vision. Literally, it's like looking through the world through a paper towel tube. You only see this much because your mind is honed in on anything that is threatening. It's like I remember I used to spar in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and this whole flight-fight response would ignite, and I really got to know it well. And it actually helped calm me down. It helped me create or find clarity in the moment. I realized I had a choice. And this is how you get out of that frozen, out of it, the flight, fight, freeze, or fawn response is your ability to see options, your perspective, to comprehend the situation. So when I was sparring with higher belts, people I know I just couldn't beat, I would go into defensive mode. Before I learned a defensive game, I would panic. I'd get really aggressive and try to fight. And they would just use technique to leverage me and trap me in certain submissions. And I learned from that. I would learn from my mistakes, and I would pick up on what they're doing. They didn't fight harder. They didn't get more aggressive. They simply applied technique. And that taught me was being aggressive and panicking and getting angry wasn't going to solve the situation. It wasn't going to help me win the match or even defend myself effectively where I wouldn't get submitted. My mind began to replay the instructions, the training, the lessons, and I realized rely upon my knowledge, rely upon what I know, what I was taught. And I began to think rather than react, because it's just a reaction. The flight, fight, freeze, or fawn response is merely a reaction. There's no real sense of having control over your life. There's no real sense of certainty or being able to control the outcome to produce the results that you want, to win and succeed at life, to find fulfillment and find happiness and find joy in life. It's impossible to do when you're in a flight, fight, or stuck in that flight, fight, freeze, or fawn response. You get frozen in there. You're stuck in the fawn response. Or you're constantly avoiding circumstance. You're not thinking clearly. You're not seeing your options because of the tunnel vision. It's the sympathetic nervous system. When you're stuck in this stressed out state, you cannot see options. You can't think clearly. It's not a good idea to make decisions when you're stressed. You calm down. You clear your head. You come to a state of a calmed heart. Then you make a decision. So when understanding this, you can apply it to your everyday life. Maybe you didn't have a traumatic experience, but you understand when you're triggered in this stress response, when you're stressed, working long hours. That's what they say. Let tomorrow decide. Think about it. Rest on it. Calm your mind. Then make a decision. Make a decision when you're in a better state of mind. Because when you're triggered, it's very difficult to think clearly. It's very difficult to respond effectively. It's very difficult to commit to any real action that is constructive for your career or your relationship. And this chronic, what is very common both with PTSD and CPTSD is a state of hypervigilance. You're constantly on guard. You're constantly waiting for someone to mess up so you have a reason to yell at them. You have a reason to not talk to them. You have a reason to avoid them and say no. It's like being afraid, living life scared. It's not a very healthy way to live. There's a lot of hormones, stress hormones, cortisol to be specific, that gets elevated. And cortisol has a lot of beneficial things, but the negative impact is it eats away brain tissue. It slows your metabolism down. It stops the TSH production and thyroxine production. Your immune system, 80% is inside of your gut, and that shuts down. So you start to have digestive problems. That's why people who are stressed don't digest food well. People who are stress case, they get a lot of cramps and indigestion because their digestive system shuts down. That's why people who are stressed tend to get sick easier because their immune system is shut down. That's what happens with the flight, fight, freeze, or fawn response. Stress is the same thing. Stress is manageable, though. Getting triggered and overwhelmed with anger, rage, fear, guilt, and shame is not. And that's why it creates problems in your life. Now, there is a way out of this. There's a way to, let me check the timer, I'm on 24 minutes. There's a way to manage your emotions. There's a way to calm yourself, and it's not easy. It doesn't happen overnight. This is what I did. I lived in a yoga ashram and practiced asanas and these postures and breath work and mantras and meditation. And it really helped regulate and calm my mind. Now, I also lived with a Native American shaman. I also studied psychology, gone through some life coaching courses myself, and learned how to overcome challenges in my teenage years. So I learned how to focus my mind at an early age. And of all the things that has helped me in life, it's my ability to focus my mind that has helped me the most. Now, I just had a natural ability to focus my mind, but much of yoga is ultimately cultivating a focused mind called dharani and dhyani, meditation, concentration, and meditation. All of yoga is designed to create this focused mind, to be focused in the present moment and not be ruled by these reactions. Because when you live a life just avoiding difficulty and only gravitating towards pleasure, you only see one half of the picture, and you're never going to accept any challenge that comes your way. You're going to cower away from it, and nobody likes a coward. It takes courage to overcome these things, to face yourself, to face your inner demons, these bad feelings that are running your mind, creating these false ideas about life and people. A deluded way of life, if you will. You look at a person in a catatonic state, you kind of feel sorry for them, but you got to think that they're not in tune with reality. They're in a state of psychosis. And when you're not in touch with reality, you can't live life effectively. It just makes it almost impossible to have a successful career or a successful relationship. People with CPTSD and people in PTSD tend to go from job to job, live life impulsively, never really make any genuine connections, long-lasting friendships, to find a sense of loyalty, a sense of family within their life. So you may feel very isolated in your life. You may feel like you got to do everything on your own. And it's not a good feeling to feel isolated and to feel like you don't belong anywhere because of these emotions, because of this shame that you feel, all because of the trauma. Now, I tried to compact a lot of information into this video because I wanted to create an understanding on what trauma is, what its impact is, two different primary types of trauma. There are many types of trauma, many behavioral patterns and personality disorders that arise from trauma. But trauma is at the root of it all. And when you undo the trauma, for me, I got to find a state of forgiveness. And forgiveness is not absolving somebody of their wrongdoings. Forgiveness is the willingness to let go of the pain and resentment that I carried from the trauma. I walked around in my teenage years very angry with a chip on my shoulder, up through my adulthood. I never knew what this anger was, what this avoiding responsibility and accountability was, until I realized it was the emotional dysregulation. That's all that it is. When you boil it all down to, and it's a very simplified form, that is the cornerstone, that's the root of many personality disorders, many behavioral problems, because of the emotional dysregulation, because nobody taught you. We don't learn this in school. Your parents don't know about it. So you can't blame yourself. Well, I'm such a terrible person. I have these behavioral problems. I lash out at people. I don't know what's wrong with me. That story, that conversation often happens when you experience multiple problems in your life, relationship after relationship, job after job. Experiencing instability, having an unstable mind wreaks havoc in your life because of the emotional dysregulation is at the root of the mental instability, the emotional instability. When you learn to regulate your emotions, you can come to a state of inner peace and clarity in the mind to make better decisions for yourself. And that doesn't happen overnight. I can help you do that because this is what I specialize in. And not just finding inner peace, but creating success and fulfillment, moving beyond the state of contentment and actually experiencing abundance, freedom, and fulfillment in your life is what I do. Through 5 steps. 1, we need to look at what goals do you want to have? What's getting in the way of those goals? And we're at number 2, it's going to be your mindset. Because these emotional regulations, these inner stories that you tell yourself about the world that has its roots in the memories of trauma, which creates these distortions of life because you can only see the world through a paper towel tube. You're not seeing the life in the big picture. You can't see the horizon. Keeps you from seeing possibility for yourself in your life. And when you get rid of that viewpoint of only seeing a limited possibility for yourself, when you realize that anything is possible, then you need to understand the skills that are needed to create that possibility. And that's number 3. Without those skills, you're not going to create the life. And then number 4 is commitment. We need to create a goal and look at how you fulfill that goal through committed, consistent actions. And then number 5, we got to take care of that trauma because those emotions are going to creep up in your quest for success. Until you understand them, until you learn to forgive and let them go, you're going to continue carrying this resentment, this sadness, this rage, this resentment. It's only going to get in the way. So healing is number 5. And that's how you create a successful, fulfilling, abundant life of freedom and joy. And that's what you really want. My contact information will be below this video and podcast. This is Dr. Spencer Coaches. Thank you so much for listening. I sure hope that helps.